Well, good morning. How's everyone doing today? Good, good. Well, I see some new faces here. So let me go and tell you a little bit about our church. So our church is rather unique, or at least we think we're unique, and we present that to the community because we're the church for those who have given up on church, which means we do things a little bit differently, and we have different focus on things. And one of them being that this experience right now, this preaching experience, is not about whoever's on stage. But this church experience is about the people of God coming together to be the people of God. So we always do this thing before we begin a message where we stop and we give a round of applause and appreciation to someone, because in this world, it's easy to be underappreciated. It's easy to do that in our marriages and all of our relationships, to have these expectations and to go through a cycle and you stop showing appreciation. But that's not the narrative that we're trying to tell here. We're trying to tell a narrative where those who have given up on church, who felt like they were unappreciated, and that's why they gave up, they can find a place here and know that we appreciate people here. And one of those that we want to give appreciation to this morning, give a round of applause to, is actually our Relentless leaders. Now, the Relentless group is our youth group, and it's starting up this Wednesday. We're going to be here in this ballroom at 6:30, and we have all these leaders who are excited, who are prepared, and let me tell you, they're heroes, because this summer we had to make an audible, change our plans, because I don't know if you guys know this, but there was a pandemic that happened and kind of changed everything. And so we had on the fly to change our summer plans. But you know what? Our leaders stepped up and they invested into our students. And I've heard from many of our students saying how much they really enjoy the small groups we did with them this summer, and how we just poured into their lives, and how excited they were week after week to be part of these groups. And so let's give a round of applause for our leaders, right? On a slightly different note, I know we kind of started off a little bit of excitement there, but I want to share with you a little bit of an opposite end kind of story. So a few weeks ago, I observed the virtual memorial service for one of my favorite professors who passed away a couple weeks ago. They did a virtual service, and not because of COVID or anything, but because of his influence. There was people all around the world who wanted to be a part of this memorial service. So they had this big thing online, and one day at work, I took time to stop and observe it. And this guy, his name was David Reese, and he was an extraordinary guy. He was in his 70s, and you would never guess that he was that old, because you'd always see him running around campus. He'd be sprinting, always preparing for his next marathon, or he'd be riding a bike up and down the hills. But he was incredibly relational, where he would just stop in the middle of what he was doing, and he would actually listen to what was going on in your life. Like when he communicated with people, he wasn't looking for the next opportunity to speak. He was looking for the next opportunity to listen to someone. And he had this way that when he spoke in class, when he taught, you just got goosebumps. Like, man, this guy really knows what he's talking about. This guy really has a relationship with God. In fact, it would be in the first 10 minutes of the class, after he'd give his little greeting, before he dives into the material, he would always do the same thing. He would take off his glasses, turn off the lights, and then he would pray. And they would be these prayers that were so emotional, so intense. You're just sitting there thinking, I don't need to know anything else we're going to talk about today, because this was the crowning moment in my day, to be able to see someone who loves God that deeply talk to God that intimately. In fact, when I first met Doc, God kind of brought Doc, that was his nickname, God kind of brought Doc into my life at a very crucial moment. The crucial moment where I was sitting there thinking, I don't know if I want to be part of this whole church thing. Like, I was still a Christian, but I was like, do I really want to invest my life in the difficult work of getting people to love God and love people? And then I met Doc. And within the first 10 minutes of meeting him, he was praying, and I was sitting there thinking, I have to spend the next 4 years studying under this man's feet. That changed the direction of my life in a lot of powerful ways, to let me know I can't do anything other than the calling of which God has called me to. Doc was a great individual. And he taught me a lot of lessons in life as a mentor, and one of them was about how we can thrive in the storms of life. As he's talking through the Old Testament and things like that, you just can't help but see how the Israelites were constantly in storms, and he would always bring it to our level and start talking about how we can survive and thrive in the storms of life. And as a church, we've been in this series all summer long talking about these tragic moments, these storms that come out of nowhere, these things that come out and they just completely change the direction of our lives. And the past 2 weeks, we've been talking about not just how we survive these moments, but how we can thrive and be better people because of these moments that happen in our lives. But one thing we've not addressed is how do we thrive when it's not us going through a situation, but it's the community around us. When the world around us is breaking apart, how can we thrive? Because the way that people have been responding to chaos is oftentimes with more chaos. And this brings the question of when we're in a world that's broken, how do we live differently? How do we respond to the chaos around us? This is a big theme in Scripture, and I want to take us through a journey of uncovering this. And I want to start off in the book of Judges. So if you have a Bible and you like to follow along, we'll be in Judges chapter 2. But Judges kind of picks up right on the coattails of another book, of the book of Joshua. And the book of Joshua is about how the Israelites, they've come out of Egypt, they've come out of the slavery, and they've been going through the wilderness for 40 years, and God has molded them, God has shaped them, God has given them laws and different ways of saying, here's how you live differently, here's how I'm going to work through you. If you just stay obedient to my way of being human, if you be obedient to this, I'm going to work through you to fix the rest of the world. And that's kind of the promise. And you get into Joshua, and Joshua is the story of conquest. It's about the Israelites, this little insignificant nation working with this mighty God to claim a land of their own. And everything's great. And then Joshua dies. And that's where the book of Judges picks up, is right when Joshua, their leader, has died. And there's this question, this vacuum of how are we going to continue following God? But you read, and there's this group of people who have heard of these promises of God. They've seen God do amazing things with the plagues, and they watched for 40 years as God was protecting them by a literal tornado, whether it was fire or whether it was wind, standing outside of their camp, always protecting them for years. And they're seeing all this time God do amazing things when they're in the conquest and they're winning these battles over some horrible battle plan strategies that God is still bringing victories out of. Immediately when Joshua dies, things take a terrible turn. Because we read in Judges chapter 2, and it says in verse 11, it says, "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger." So get this. These people were supposed to be the hope. See, if you read the first 11 chapters of Genesis, humanity's in a bad place, and God invests in Abraham. He's like, Abraham, I'm going to make a family out of you, and I'm going to work through this family to redeem the world. And this is the people who, they know God's ways. They have the 10 Commandments. They have all the laws, and they've been following them, and the priests and the sacrifices, and they have the whole shebang. And then they, who know better, give up on God. You see, they got the little piece of land that they wanted. They had their home. They had maybe a building. And immediately, they kind of look at God and say, God, thank you for what you gave us, but we're good now. Like, you gave us something that we wanted, but you know what? This relationship, we don't think it's going to last, okay? You know, yes, you've given us all these blessings, but that's really just what we wanted. And so they pull away from God and they go chasing after all these other gods because these other gods were just promises of power, sex, and money. And that's all that they wanted. And they gave up on God. And you can't help but read this and be thinking, what are you thinking? Like, do you not know what God has done for you? God has given you salvation. God has given you new life, and this is how you treat him? Is that you abandon the one who rescued you? And here's how God responds to this. God is obviously pretty mad about this, being treated like this, because we see in verse 14, it says, "So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to the plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies." So because they gave up on God, and they said, God, we know you did these great things for us, but we like this thing over here. We like this sin. We like living like this over here. So if you could just get out of the way, because we're going to go in this direction, things don't go so well. And God lets them go into that sin, which leads into slavery, which leads into all these people coming and ruling over them and taking advantage of them and hurting them. And this is the cycle where they're just sitting in this pain. In fact, this chapter 2 of Judges, is kind of giving a table of context, a summary of everything that happens, because this is what they continue doing, where they continue to sin, and it leads into slavery, it leads into everything falling apart, but God is a God of rescue. Because God has called a people to be his family. And if you read the stories in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that's a common narrative that God is a rescuer, that while people might give up on him, he doesn't give up on humanity. And so he goes and he rescues them by sending judges. And now we like the judges, okay? Especially men. Yeah, we like reading Judges because there are all these stories about these heroes who are battle warriors, and they charge into battle and they eliminate the enemy, and it's great and it's wonderful. And that's why the text tells us in verse 18, it says, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. So eventually when the people get tired of their sin and they cry out to God, they humble themselves saying, God, we need your help. We've made a mess of things. Won't you come and save the day? God does by sending a judge. And the judge comes in, like I said, and they're like heroes, superheroes, and they're doing all these amazing things, and they're kicking out the enemy, and it seems like it's all great. But it doesn't last. Because the chaos was in the world around them, and they're responding to chaos with more chaos. Where their solution was, hey, let's do violence, let's get the enemy out. And that worked for a little while, but it never lasted. Because the problem wasn't out there. The problem was what was in the people's hearts. And the judges, while they might be able to get rid of the enemy, they weren't able to change the hearts of the people. And so not long after the judge would pass away, the people would just go back to the same old sins that they've always done. That's what the text tells us in verse 19. It says, but whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers. The problem only gets worse. Going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them, they did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. See, this is the cycle of Judges. Where first there is sin that leads into slavery, leads into addiction, leads into a constant mess. And then comes a point where the people just can't stand going back to those same sins, those same problems, and they cry out to God saying, God, won't you please rescue us? And then God does. He sends them someone to rescue them, someone to get them out of their problem. And for a while, things are great. And then they just go back to the same problems. Those same sins, those same relationships, those same habits that they've always had. And it only leads to the same problem because the chaos in the world wasn't just out there. It was in the hearts of the people. Where something had to change within them in order for them to be who they were meant to be. Because we can look around at this world and be like, this world is awful. But it takes a lot of guts and a lot of humility to be able to look inside yourself and say, these same problems I see going on out there are the same chaos is playing in my own heart as well. And I need a little help. It takes a lot of humility to get there. But unfortunately, these people who know God's ways, who God had invested into, still continue to not learn the lesson. And still continue to rebel and reject God. And so the text tells us in verse 20, it says, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. Notice with me, God did not refer to the Israelites in this story as my people. Before this, anytime God was talking about the Israelites, he always said, my people. And he said, Israel is my son. There was this deep intimacy. But notice right here, he says, those people. Like, hey, I don't even recognize these people anymore because they're no longer who they were supposed to be. Because they have fallen into this horrible cycle and they just have abandoned God and given up on him. And they still had the same temple practices. They were still doing the same sacrifices. But they weren't recognizable anymore. Sometimes we can get in that same way. Like, I'm betting there's some times in our lives where you make a mistake and you can't help but think, did I just make the same mistake I've made 1,000 times prior? Why do I keep doing this? And we find ourselves in these cycles where we see chaos and we respond with more chaos. We just keep going back to the same sins, the same problems, those same relationships over and over and over. And it seems like, will we ever learn? I'm hoping you're seeing that this problem in the world that's so easy to say, hey, look, there's problems out there, they're playing in our own heart as well. But there's a solution. See, we need a new way to respond, and God has given us that new way to respond. We can see it in play in the book of Ruth. You see, when you read the book of Judges, you have to read the book of Ruth at the exact same time, because the book of Ruth opens up saying this. The very first words, it says, in the days when the judges ruled. Saying, hey, the story that's about to take place is not a story of, hey, how you can have a better marriage or parenting relationship like we oftentimes hear. The story of Ruth is how do we live God's ways, being who we were supposed to be, a way of faith, when we live in a world like the Judges. When we live in a world that's broken and that's responding to chaos with only more chaos. How do we live a different way? And let me give you some quick pointers on the story of Ruth. See, the story of Ruth begins with a woman who was an immigrant. She was a Moabite, the people who were once enemies at times with Israel. That's who Ruth is. She's not one of the people of God, but she marries into the family of God. And she's traveling with her husband, her brother-in-law, and her sister-in-law, and her father-in-law and mother-in-law. And they're traveling from Moab back into Israel. And along the way, everyone dies or leaves. And it's just Ruth and her mother-in-law named Naomi. And there's this turning point in the book of Ruth, right in the beginning of, will Ruth, okay, the main character, will she continue on into the land of the judges where she's going to be an outcast, where she's not going to have any security, where no one's welcoming her, no one's waiting for her. This is a terrible place. And you're got to be thinking, okay, these are the people who know how they should be living, and they're messing it up on purpose. Like you want to stop and scream, Ruth, get out of Dodge. That's not the place you want to be. But then Ruth does something dramatic, where she looks at her mother-in-law, Naomi, who was an Israelite, who did her best to love God and love people. And Ruth looks at her and says these very powerful words in the book of Ruth. Verse 16, where Ruth tells her, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. And your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. See, at this moment, in a time of disaster, in a time of chaos, in a time where you're sitting and thinking, you don't want to be among the people of God. Here's Ruth saying to one of them, I'm in this for the long haul. I'm by your side. Where you go, I will go. And it's this echo that we see later on in the Gospels of Jesus calling for us in a world of chaos to love like he has loved, to serve like he has served, to follow him as he follows God as God. And so here's this story of Ruth, where a woman in the day of judges, in a day of chaos, is saying, I'm choosing a different way to respond to what's going on. I'm going to choose love. A model which Christ calls his followers to thousands of years later. A model which we see playing a part all across the Old Testament, that there is a better way to respond to chaos, and it's not more chaos, it's love. For love is our response to chaos. Love is our response to chaos. The easy thing is when we see problems in this world, when we see chaos, the easy thing would be to just do what everyone else is doing to feed into that chaos. But God has called us in a different way. See, we might still live in the world of Judges where things are a little messy. Things aren't the way they were supposed to be, and people who know better still make this world a problem sometimes. We all do, because we're all sinners. We all need a little help. But God has given us a new way, one that is of love. And here's the thing, Ruth was able to show it, and that was before Jesus. So we who know who Jesus is, who have Jesus in our lives, and see that Jesus is the King of the world, who is making this world right, and he's beginning that work inside of us, and he has given us his Holy Spirit, we should be able to then love in our response to chaos. Which means that we don't always have to have things our way, but we love one another. We see one another. We listen to one another. We invest in one another. That was something that Doc Reese stressed all the time in his classes. As he's walking us through the Old Testament, things like that, he would always go back and say, what if love is what it's all about? What if love is what it means to be made in the image of God and to be who we were meant to be? What if that is what it all comes down to? And truthfully, that's what I see as well. And we could all do better at this. Because like I said, our natural inclination is to fight fire with fire, but God has called us to respond to chaos with love. Just like he who came to our world, who took on flesh, who suffered a cross at the hands of people that he created, and he let them kill him so that he could pour out his love on all of us. So that you and I could be part of his family, to have our lives changed and follow a new course after Jesus. We need more Ruths in this world. People who are going to be like this. People who are going to look at one another and say, I'm with you. I'm sticking beside you. I'm going to go through this with you. Where you go, I'm going to go, because we're responding with love for one another. That we're sharing each other's burdens. That we're going through this crazy life together because we love one another. We need more Ruths like that. But you know what we also need more of? Naomi's. See, I know the book is called Ruth, and Ruth is kind of the protagonist, but in my opinion, Naomi is the bigger hero. Because Naomi lives a life that inspires someone outside of the family of God to want to be part of it. Because the way that Naomi, who loved God and loved people, the way she loves God and loves people, inspired someone who was once an enemy to say, no, I want to be part of this. I'm going to be part of this story. I'm going to follow with you in loving God and loving people. That's what we need more in the world. Like, I would love it if we all got to the point of, hey, we're Ruths and we're loving people, we're in response to chaos, but what I want to do is call us to a higher standard of what if we lived a life that was so much about love God, love people, that we inspired those outside of these four walls to say, you know what, I want to be a friend with you. I want to be with you. I want to sit at the lunch table with you. I want to work on projects with you because you have this thing. I don't know what it is, but it makes you different. What if we lived lives like that? Where we looked around at others and say, who can I invest in? Who can I possibly inspire to want to love God and love people more? Which is a reason why this morning we're doing an elder nomination or elder ordination. Because we're recognizing men who are standing up and basically in a simple way taking on the call to be Naomi's for us to inspire a sense of Ruth in all of us. Eldership is a very high calling. It's a very high spiritual responsibility. And like I said, it comes down to, nurturing the saints and reaching the lost, or in a very simple way of understanding it of these are people who are going to be Naomi's for us. So that we might be Ruth's, so we might learn how to be Naomi's for the future Ruths out there. Which is why at this point we're going to move into our service of calling up our current elders and their wives to join me up here on stage as we move in the direction of ordaining these men. And like I said, let me go ahead and give a recap of these elders and their responsibilities, okay? So our board of elders are the individuals who are in charge of taking care of our vision and mission as a church. So like everything they do is about evaluating the effectiveness of all we do. You see, you guys might think the church is just run by Dave and I as the pastors, but we actually have a team of elders who use their time and their energy and their resources to make sure that we're the church that we need to be. A church for those who have given up on church. A church where it all comes down to love God and love people. And it's a wonderful blessing to be able to work with men like this who have that heart to want to invest in all of us so that we can be who we were meant to be.